My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school role-playing game podcast.
And in this episode, I only regret that I have but one hit die to lose for my party. Truly, these are times that fry men's souls.
Our first segment is a basic crawl. Times That Fry Men's Souls is a 139-page, quote, weird history campaign during the American Revolution for use with old-school fantasy role-playing games, featuring 80 map hexes and 185 encounters with war, spies, crime, nature, and oddities, including 10 scenarios of the supernatural and tables of useful information. The book starts with an introduction that gives an overview of what's in the book and other ways to use the book. Historical accuracy is noted here as well as notes about money, weapons, and equipment. And then we have part the first, which includes a campaign hex map, travel information about the weather, and so forth. We are given story threads, which is a list of hexes connected by stories or items. For example, the American Spy Ring, Young Runaways versus the Wicked Uncle, and others. And finally, in this section, we have what is the bulk of the book, the encounter descriptions. Part the second, Weird Tales of the Supernatural. This is a set of 10 scenarios that you can use in addition to the encounters on the campaign hex map. These scenarios have titles, wonderful titles, such as Revenge of the Devil Child, Throne of the Raven Man, Demons of the Dogstar Dolmen, The Iron Messiah, and Straight to Hell.
And finally, we have part the third, tables of useful information, which are colonial American names, Algonquin names, names of British troops, names of Hessian mercenaries, French and Canadian names, other European names, character background details, distinguishing physical marks, 76 random minor NPCs, everyday personal items, weapons and armor, periodicals and books, sensitive political items, weird items, typical colonial locations, typical colonial meals, random encounters, and random weirdness.
Tom, how have you used Times That Fry Men's Souls?
Okay, I have used Times That Fry Men's Souls on 3 occasions, 3 sessions with my Saturday open table group. One session using Into the Odd, in which, it would have used one of the supernatural scenarios in the back, but they kind of hex crawled their way around the scenario, so it was just a pretty straight-ahead sandbox game. And then 2 sessions of Trophy Gold, which were kind of linked. They had the same bestiary and one PC that appeared in both sessions. And one of those was doing the Revenge of the Devil Child scenario, for the most part. And then the second one, and we'll talk about it more later, was kind of only using the background because I was running Tomb of the Serpent Kings, which is an entirely underground dungeon adventure, but using all the character creation options from this book. So it was a bunch of 1700s musket-wielding adventurers doing the dungeon delving.
Yeah, I'm curious how it went to have Tomb of the Serpent Kings in an American Revolution implied setting. So that'll be very interesting to hear later.
And you've just read the book, I take it?
I have just read the book,
okay.
Yeah. So let's talk about what we liked about Times That Fry Men's Souls. I'm going to just start off by saying I think this book is fucking brilliant. I loved every minute of it. And the thing that it does most brilliantly can be summarized with the phrase, at the referee's discretion. You see this phrase throughout the hex crawl descriptions, which our intro doesn't emphasize enough, in my opinion, how that is the bulk of the book. These are these hex crawl encounters, right? And, okay, so at the referee's discretion. What I love about this series of encounters is you're presented with archetypes of the American Revolutionary War, these characters who are in certain sorts of situations. Oftentimes they are just people in little towns or farmers, that kind of thing, with seemingly mundane problems and circumstances, or problems and circumstances that you might find in the time period. But many of the hex entries give the referee an option to make the encounter more sinister, and this option is usually presented in the text with, at the referee's discretion. So, for example, there's one hex where you encounter this nature historian, or this sort of natural historian, who's doing some drawings of local flora and fauna, and that can just be all he is. But at the referee's discretion, he can be a British spy. In another encounter, a British officer is offering a reward for anyone who can kill the wild cat that killed his boatman, but at the referee's discretion, you can make it so that the officer himself killed this boatman during a tragic quarrel. There's like this village at a certain point that seems kind of standoffish, and maybe the reason why is because they have been torturing a child killer they have imprisoned in a cellar. It's a really, really terrific way of organizing the information and presenting these encounters. What I love about it is it adds a lot of richness and menace to the whole thing, but also it's very helpful for games, I imagine, very helpful for games like Dungeon World or Trophy Gold, where you, as the referee, frequently have to reveal some kind of unwelcome truth or complication as a result of a die roll, and here it's just kind of baked into the text, right? So it can be maybe this slightly insane farmer who talks about having married a mermaid, maybe he's just that, but maybe on a poor die roll or a complication, according to the text, maybe the mermaid's real, right? And you may have to encounter the mermaid later. So I just thought it was really great. It added so much like texture and possibility to these encounters, and I thought it was really terrific.
Yeah, and you're right to mention the systems that generate complications for that, because although it was good with Into the Odd, the way it was laid out, it was very useful for Trophy Gold, the one that was above ground that we played, where, as you say, sometimes you have to chuck something in. And so, yeah, as soon as I read each paragraph, I had, in the back of my mind, I was like, okay, save this for later when something goes a little awry. And actually, I want to talk quickly about the format of these hex description pages, because from what we've just discussed, it might sound like these are these very elaborate, slightly overwritten scenario texts that you get sometimes where there's so much going on and it's so ornate that it is difficult to use, but that's not the case here. Each hex has one page, and you get a paragraph of one thing that's happening, so maybe the botanist, the natural historian that you mentioned. Then there's a second paragraph of another thing that's going on, which will normally be like the settlement or an argument that's going on there. And then the third thing is always a very short paragraph about the environment.
Right.
So it'll be plants that are growing that might be useful, or an animal, or sometimes, I think with the mermaid, that's like, that takes the environment. If the mermaid is real,
right,
then that's what appears in the third paragraph. But actually, a whole paragraph dedicated to a monster or something magic are fairly rare in the text, I think. Haven't played every hex, there's quite a lot of them. But and it's so easy to use. You flip to that page is the whole hex for you. And it's good execution on the whole thing.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And another thing I liked about it, which is kind of not to contravene what you just said, but to sort of half piggyback on it. Yes, the hex text is fairly succinct and easy to work with, it seems. I haven't done it myself, but it does seem pretty easy to follow. But at the same time, it's also quite rich in detail, I thought, but not hyper detailed. Like you said, it's not like an overwhelming amount of detail, but the detail seems very, very carefully chosen. The sorts of things that the author chooses to emphasize in the text is just enough to sort of bring out the setting. So animals and plant life that are sort of local to the region, they really sing on the page and they kind of come alive. And sometimes it's just the name of the thing, or just a very, very like brief description, like a line of description, but it's enough. The whole thing seems very well researched. So like in this module, we don't just have mussels, we have dwarf wedge mussels. Whoever heard of American worm seed or white dwarf kidney beans, right? The geography and the towns also seem very well researched. There's a certain amount of care and attention that went into the historical aspects of this setting, and I really appreciated that. But like you said, it's not overwhelming. It's not masturbatory. It's just enough to get going, I think. Yeah,
right. And it really pegs the feeling of time and place, which is one of the concerns I had before I bought it, basically, was I can only give kind of very general, if I'm GMing, how am I going to describe upstate New York in... I don't even know when this is set, exactly which year. I just know it's sometime during the American Revolution. This is not my period. Give me 1910s China, fine, but this is beyond my, not in my wheelhouse. And then, but it is just enough. And those names and things, so you get a name of a plant and what it's useful for. Like, do you cook it in a soup or does it make a medicine or something? And that's just enough. What it reminds me of, actually, is reading All the Pretty Horses. But is that Cormac McCarthy?
I believe that's right, yeah.
There's lots of stuff about the plants that the characters see as they're traveling down into Mexico. And I remember I'll be reading it on the tram thinking, man, I should look up some of these Spanish plant names at some point so I know exactly what these plants look like. And do you know what? I never did, but I still felt like I'd kind of visited that part of the country. You know, it was having the names is enough to give you that sense of authenticity.
It's very in vogue right now in the world of like culinary arts to have like regional cookbooks that focus on ingredients and plants and things that are maybe no longer as well known, right? This is particularly the case for sort of Southern American regional cookbooks. And I was trying to like think of some for the companion adventures. I've seen some, but I just couldn't remember any of them in time or do the research on it. But I kind of had that same feeling, like you said, when I was reading it. It was like, it feels like this module is sort of bringing back some things that maybe we don't know about anymore, that in the modern times, like maybe they don't exist anymore, these plants or these animals, or maybe we understand them differently now or whatever. It was a very interesting read in that way. And kind of piggybacking off that, as the American in our little duo here.
The token North American in this. Oh,
yes, exactly. I will tell you that Times That Fry Men's Souls, this book feels distinctly North American, which I found to be very refreshing because most fantasy stuff, of course, is of the McEurope variety. There is, for example, an omnipresent, almost personal relationship with the devil in this book. That feels like a distinctly American tradition to me because, of course, we're very fond of our, many of us anyway, are very fond of our personal relationship with Christ. But the other side of that coin is the devil is kind of there as well. And you can see that in a lot of like American folk music, for example, or like more recent things like The Devil Went Down to Georgia, that kind of thing, right? This idea of the devil is just like right there, right? Like that comes through a lot in this module. There is a bestiary that feels a lot like cryptids, such as the big monstrous bass, the naked bear. One of the scenarios is basically the Jersey Devil story. The giant squid, the monsters have a sort of cryptid quality, and that to me has always felt like a sort of distinctly American kind of thing, right? This idea of like cryptids and folk monsters, right? Or at least North American. I can't speak to how accurate any of it is, but there is a significant presence of an emphasis on native cultures, and also an emphasis on the sort of hard pioneer people, right? Like this sort of idea of pioneer men and pioneer women is a thing in the American ideal, right? So all that stuff kind of comes through in the book really nicely.
Oh yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the native cultures. There's not, as you said, there's not very much in the book on it, but then there's not that much about being an English settler either. It's just that
right, yeah.
they have a list of names. The other groups have a list of names. And when I ran this, of course, I'm playing games in Hong Kong. And so we're looking through the lists of all these European names. And so the one French guy had decided to play a French-Canadian trapper, fine. And then the two other players being like ethnic Chinese, they were just looking at all these European names and they were like, man, all this white people stuff is too complicated. Can't we just be natives? And we're like, yeah, sure, let's do that. So we had it. That was our group. And of course, that was interesting because then I think there is a bit of an assumption that the majority of the group will be like white colonists or whatever. But when you're playing native characters or just from further afield, that you intersect with the storylines that are happening throughout the sandbox in a slightly different way, but still interestingly, which was good. And it gave me an angle I never would have. Well, I mean, it just made me think on my feet because, of course, I'd read all this stuff thinking, well, they're going to be like soldiers or spies or something, and then they weren't. So, yeah, it was good.
Yes, yeah, no, I like that. That's interesting to hear. That's how it kind of played out at your table. What are some other things that you liked about this?
To talk about the historical aspect, I would say I think one thing I like about this is that the future from after this whole war thing blows over is not presented as a fait accompli, right? So there's a lot of references throughout the text of people not being interested in American dollars because they think the Americans are going to lose and therefore the money won't be worth anything. So everyone's trying to get pound sterling all the time.
Yeah, I like that. I thought that was a great touch too. I enjoyed that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, to a degree, I guess it's a little bit like that joke that every World War One film has where someone goes, don't worry, chaps, this will all be over by Christmas. And you're meant to go, oh, right, because it's irony.
Right.
But also, I think it's good. It paints the picture that this is a time when no one knows what the outcome's going to be. And I compare that to a time I was reading some scenarios set during the same revolution. I want to say colonial Gothic. I mean, they were fine as adventures, I think, but I was reading the whole thing just thinking, why does it assume that you want to help these rebel guys? They seem roughly as bad as the others. So, like, from the perspective of a citizen of the Republic of Ireland, it just seems like a bunch of English people with money shooting at each other. So, it's and then I think Times of Fry Men's Souls doesn't particularly, I mean, yeah, it says patriots versus loyalists, so it has that language bias slightly, but I don't think it pushes you to believe that one side is necessarily an obvious victor or obviously virtuous.
Right. I'll tell you something else I liked about this is I thought it made really good use of public domain art. We've talked about public domain art in the past, and sometimes we love it, sometimes we don't love it. I really loved it here because what they did was they basically took like public domain art and sort of mashed it up to be something spookier and scarier.
Is it woodcuts mostly, I think?
I think it was, yeah. But what I found interesting was some of the art pieces I've seen separate components of it in other places. Like there's one of this quite bloated demon man. I've seen that a million times. It's like sort of a famous newspaper cartoon, but the way it was kind of like remixed here to make him look like a demon, I thought was really, really cool. Or the one of, I think it's Washington, like talking to a goat-headed devil man or something.
Yeah, the goat-headed devil man, which I think was the illustration that I copied out of the PDF to convince you that this was a good idea to review.
Right, yeah. I thought it was a very clever use of public domain art. Great. So props. I wish there was more of it. Like I think it was only like 3 or 4 pieces, but it was still pretty good. Yeah.
I imagine it's a little painstaking to make, so that's probably why there's not more of it.
Yeah, for sure. Anything else you want to mention before we head on?
Yeah, sure. Let's talk a little bit about the executions. Yeah, we talked about the mundane treasures in each hex. And, the other thing about a lot of hexes refer to other hexes. So we briefly touched on this in the intro. You'll have there are some runaway children, and they've got a wicked uncle who's searching for them, and they'll be in different locations. So making a big list of what those all were under the category story threads and sticking it in the intro, that was a really good idea. When I've run this, every time I've flipped to that, looked for the name of something I think is going to be interesting, and then just printed out those pages. And then I'll have the rest of the PDF on hand in case I need to refer, in case the players wander off somewhere else. But I'll just kind of have that part ready, so that's really good. And then the other thing I think is really interesting about this is it's a sandbox that's quite small, but you feel like you're properly exploring in the same way that you do if you do I don't know, Carcosa or Yunsuin. It feels like a big packed full of stuff journey, but it's actually not that. I think as a note you could travel it in its entire length maybe within a week or two. So you could start any session in any hex and it's believable. You traveled here by coach and this is what you're doing. But as soon as you start doing the adventure, suddenly going hex by hex becomes a thing because of all these armies crawling around the place and so on. And I think that's really interesting, the idea that the actual distance is quite small, but you're always worrying about what's around the next bend in the road in a way that on the sort of quite grand travel-based hex crawls or point crawls, maybe something like UVG or one of the bears, Slumbering Ursine Dunes. I don't think you feel that. You're you sort of have a lot of visibility of what's coming towards you, whereas this is very cramped and uncertain. And the presence of the strange little secret bits of banal deviltry hidden within each village and so on, I think really contribute to that as well.
Fantastic. Well, shall we move on to questions we had about this book? I've been saying book instead of module because this feels like a little bit more than a module to me. But, so, questions. What'd you have, Tom?
Mine is, it's not really a question, but this is the section we put the quibbles in. So I will note there is a slight error in the table of contents. I think 2 pages got added at some point in production. And the author, Sean McAnally, did not notice. So if you're using this, whenever you're in part 3, add 2 to the page number in the contents and you'll end up in the right place.
Very good, very good. Question I had, so all these plants and things, these various types of mushrooms and sages and whatnot, did you actually use any of this? Did it come up in your game?
Amazingly, yes. Now, I thought it was just going to be background detail. Because they'd show up in a hex and I'd describe it and I'd read that bit. And I thought it would just be scene setting. And in a way it is. And I think it also helped the gritty frontier people feel of it. Your characters are the kind of people who notice plants that grow by the side of the road and know what they do. But yes, they actually did make the effort of harvesting carrots when they found them. There's one hex where there were bananas floating in the sea because a ship
I remember that
had to throw some cargo overboard, and they did paddle around collecting bananas and then sell them to the, nice. The British Navy in New York. It's in fact, I think maybe you don't need any of the treasure or the monsters. You could just send people out hunting plants, and as long as you have random encounters with people, I think you'd still have a pretty good time.
Well, it kind of goes back to that conversation we had a few episodes ago about adventures that are not like the sort of standard treasure hunting adventure. This would be perfect for that. Maybe you're an actual botanist, right? Who happens to have arrived to do their work right when a war breaks out.
Oh, agree. Actually, you say that. What was one of our player characters? I think the recurring one was some kind of naturalist, but I've forgotten what it was. But yeah, that was sort of one of the many hooks into different adventures. And it's a very period thing to do as well. It's still that kind of Age of Enlightenment studying stuff. It's believable and it feels right.
Yeah,
it's good.
Yeah. My other question, at one point there are these Bible verses, actually a couple points in the text, there are these Bible verses that are mentioned because these Bible verses are part of the cipher that you can use in the game. First part of the question, did you actually look up the Bible verses? I did, but I'm curious if you did.
No, I didn't use any of the spies or cipher stuff because I felt like it was going to go, because I have to run one shot, so I didn't think I'd have time. Why? Which passages are they? I feel like you've got some good reveal here.
Well, I did look them up. I don't actually remember the specific passages, but I did look them up, and 5 of them all have references to lions. Mm-hmm. A lion is in every verse. And then one of them does not mention a lion, but does talk about roaring. So that I feel like that was a lion connection. And then the last one doesn't have anything to do with a lion, or at least there's not in the text. Maybe there's some context there where maybe a lion is referenced, but I wasn't aware. I wasn't going to read that part of the Bible to figure it out. But it just talks about sort of the power and strength of God or whatever, right? And I didn't know what to make of it. I was trying to figure out what are all these references to lions about? But so I was curious if you had any thoughts on it, but you didn't look it up. So
no, although from memory I can say that. I mean, obviously there's the more famous verse about the devil going about roaring like a lion. So presumably the thread is trust in the power and strength of God,
right,
to defeat the most powerful things. There are a few.
That's the first one.
A few references in Psalms, I think, of the Lord breaking the teeth of the lions and stuff as well. Which is, I think, the same psalm where he also crushes the head of the dragon in the seas and so on, gives it to the people of Ethiopia for food. So yeah, I think that would be the thread, but having not looked them up, I can't.
So is the lion like a stand-in for the devil then? Is that what's going on there, or?
No, I don't think so, because I think in most cases, the lion is it's the scariest animal around,
Got it.
The wild. Okay. Right. So the devil is roaring like a lion in that most famous one, but it's like a lion. It's not that the lion represents him.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Kind of. I don't know. Any theologians or Bible scholars listening, feel free to drop us an email.
Yeah, perhaps an intrepid listener will go look those up and let us know. Yeah. Awesome. Let's go to the chain lightning round. I like this rather grim little story in the text. A once prosperous farmhouse along the Bronx River is in disrepair. A family of patriots live here. The men have already been rounded up and arrested, but the women are too stubborn to leave. The 2 youngest daughters have already been outraged multiple times by the Hessians stationed nearby. A 3rd daughter has committed suicide in the river as a result. This tragedy has galvanized the mother and elderly aunt to take action. They have booby-trapped the front and rear entrances to the home with a 6-foot-deep pit full of sharpened wooden stakes. The elderly aunt has also experimented with homemade grenades using old canning supplies, nails, flint, and leftover gunpowder. If anyone, especially the Hessians, attempts to enter this house, she hurls grenades from an upper window.
Random NPC number 37 is Bertrand Phillips, a charlatan who has set up a fake Norse ruin.
At one point you can encounter a hermit, and we learn of this hermit. If the hermit is subdued, he tells a horrific tale about the house involving cannibalism, incest, and other horrors. The punchline of the story is that the house is haunted by violent and vengeful spirits. The hermit made all of this up. He only poses as a quasi-madman. In truth, his purpose here is to guard a cache of 24 Pennsylvania long rifles buried under the floor of the fruit cellar.
In one of the sea-bordering hexes, you can find, and I quote, Katakamunkus, the giant squid, has migrated into these waters for nefarious purposes of his own.
We have a rafter of lean turkeys grazing and roosing west of the Saddle River. Hungry PCs will find this gang of turkeys particularly stupid and aggressive.
And another animal encounter. Unlike most rattlesnakes, this one is aggressive. It is extremely difficult to spot. Ironically, it attacks anyone who comes within 6 feet of it, immediately retreating and only then giving its distinctive warning rattle.
Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve. Tom, what are we talking about today?
Okay, we are talking about collaborative world building in games through implied settings, or, if you will, the anti-microscope.
We should say what Microscope is before we
move
on.
Okay. Microscope is a game where you make a setting collaboratively and then you don't actually roleplay in it. Yeah, that's pretty much it, right?
There is some role-playing in it, but it's very bad.
Yeah. So yeah, the origin of this, like my thought process, was our third session of Times That Fry Men's Souls ended up using very little of the book material. So yeah, we generated characters with the names and the backgrounds and the equipment, and the rest was only the dungeon, like because of how time worked out and how much time they spent talking to that cool snake man in the final room.
Right.
You know, we didn't get to do what would have been part 4, which would have been the trip home and like trying to get your treasure back to town without being robbed. Once you have adventurers dressing in a certain way, they've got a certain kind of name, carrying braces of pistols rather than swords and stuff, exploring quite Lovecraftian serpent folk tomb, because that is one of the things in the Cthulhu mythos, is that serpent people dwelt in North America.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Millennia ago, I believe. So then the question is, where and when is this story actually taking place? You can infer that it's some kind of European-influenced culture in the gunpowder era, but when? And then I also ran a trophy gold play-by-post of a Das Schwarze Auge adventure called De Wolf von Winhall.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, De Wolf von Winhall. The Wolf of Winhall is what it's called. And,
a classic of Dark Eye, I'm told.
Yeah, but none of us knew the setting at all, except for what was contained in the adventure. And I think our retro-engineered setting might be better than the actual one for the Dark Eye. At least it was for our purposes.
Close your ears, German listeners.
Sorry. And so, yeah, I started thinking, and of course there are lots of forerunners to this thing. So like OD&D, an Original Traveller, they only had implied settings.
Right, yeah.
For the beginning of their life. And especially Traveller relied on emergent gameplay from the random tables. It didn't really have adventures. You think about spaghetti westerns, which imply they're in the Wild West, but I mean clearly are not if you look at the landscape. Or the movies Alien and Aliens, you get these references to things and they feel like a very rich setting. But again, on screen, there's not actually that much. And so I was thinking, this is fun, but why? And how can we, take advantage
right.
of that fact? I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, it's an interesting topic because you had already done your notes and stuff before I hadn't taken a look at it yet. I was still trying to wrap my head around the topic, and I actually had kind of a hard time wrapping my head around the topic initially because it never would have even occurred to me for this to be a topic because of the way I run and play games. Obviously, there are highly, highly detailed setting books out there, but I don't really, in my gameplay, I don't really rely on those things. I kind of just take the bits that I want and then otherwise just kind of run the adventure. Having run quite literally hundreds of sessions of Dungeon World, for example, in all of those sessions of Dungeon World, I'm pretty sure we never once stated the name of the world or even the kingdom that it took place in. It was just, the story was the group of adventurers and the things that were going on in that moment, right? We didn't dwell on the wider questions of the setting. And we were kind of making it up as we go. Like in session, 10, we might have mentioned, some particular temple or something might have been asked or talked about in passing. And then in session 12 or 13, I made that a location for an adventure. So it kind of developed organically and emergently. And that's just how I play. And so I've never really given much thought to why that is the best way to play or a good way to play, or even the other side of it, like why you might want a highly, highly detailed setting. To me, those very, very highly detailed settings is kind of I'm going to make somebody mad here, but it's kind of an old-fashioned way of role-playing games, right, in my opinion. Or it can be a little too heavy-handed. It can be restrictive to creativity and imagination if handled poorly. To me, the only answer is this sort of emergent setting.
You can, and I think everyone kind of does do this emergent setting, even within quite detailed settings. Yeah, to come back to what you mentioned there, aside from the infamous M. John Harrison quote about world building being the great clumping foot of nerdism, there was an interesting thing on Ralph Lovegrove of the Fictoplasm podcast, where he wrote, and I'll quote him here, "When you flag to the players that the world is a massive construction by the mere presence of such monstrously detailed settings, it's very hard for a character to start with the idea that I'm here and this is all there is, and then be surprised by an unseen world and truly hooked into the adventure." And I think that's a little debatable. I think it would sound better if Ralph was saying it, because he has the most soothing voice in gaming podcasting today. There is something to that. There's a bit of a feeling of this game isn't about me, and so on. And of course, there are downsides as well, which I think let's get to. But yeah, I sort of want to start off with the idea of what is an implied setting by talking about what are the sources of facts as we play the game. I made a little list. I've probably missed some off, see what you can think. There is player input, saying stuff like, I am Thrud the Barbarian, and I come from a village in the north. That's establishing there are barbarians, which implies civilization. The barbarians live in the north. Then there's GM input, which is the same thing. As soon as you start describing a town or a tree, you've made something real. And then sort of third-party content, by which I mean not Dungeon Crawl Classics stuff for D&D, but rather something that you're using in your game. So if you have a random carousing table that one of your group has found and says, hey, let's roll on this, that's someone outside your group making things true in your game. And then there's effects from mechanics, right? This is why you choose different systems. So in our trophy gold games using Times at Frymen's Souls, we quickly realized that we wanted armor to be a thing mechanically because it's quite important in trophy gold.
Right.
But of course, this is a time when people were not really knocking around the place, carrying shields, wearing helmets and so on for the most part. So we started to make armor into sort of precious objects. So like a pocket-sized book of Psalms saved someone from a fatal bullet at one point because that was their armor. And
Right,
bullet
yeah.
lodges in the Bible, and let's get a silver cigarette case, which is the classic Blackadder one. And that means that you're in a genre in a world where tiny but precious items are disproportionately likely to save your life. So
Right, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, it's got all that kind of effect going on. I guess the other thing is you actually literally chat out of character, like what do we want to be in this?
Well, sure. That's what I was going to say. The sort of out-of-character table talk. I was going to also say tables. You mentioned tables, but when you said third-party content, I would go so far as to say that even in very, very well-defined settings, the tables within those settings can be much more helpful than the great big bulk of text, because the tables are the things you interact with and you bring directly into the story. Yeah, I think the one thing I would add there is definitely like out of character talk. Yeah, that's a good list though. Player input, GM input, tables, mechanical effects, and then table talk as ways of establishing facts in your emergent setting. I think that's really great.
Yeah, I mean, and so what's your experience of like different levels of explicitness in setting been? Like, I think maybe the best example of this as a deliberate game design is Apocalypse World, where you've got all these evocative things right there on your character sheet. And so everyone's Apocalypse World is a bit the same, but it's always fairly different group to group and so on. Yeah.
I'm glad you bring up Apocalypse World, because Apocalypse World famously sort of interrogates genre more than setting.
Right.
Or at least games that are powered by the apocalypse. And Apocalypse World specifically interrogates the post-apocalyptic genre. That's actually a great point. For me, I focus on genre more than setting. So to me, it's much more important that we're playing a high fantasy adventure game, or it's much more important that we're playing a sort of gritty, grim, dark, desperate sort of fantasy like in Trophy Gold. Like that to me does a lot more work in my games than the explicit setting details do. If I'm running Cthulhu Dark, in a sort of 1920s noir inflected scenario, those commonly understood film noir elements have a much bigger impact on the story than the fact that the session takes place in Calgary or whatever, right? Or,
noted film noir location, Calgary. Yeah.
I mean, what would you know what I'm saying? Like in Vancouver or whatever. That has more effect on it.
Sure.
So to answer your question, to me, I don't dwell on setting very much, right? I dwell on genre. I think genre is more important. That said, in my preparation as on the GM side of things, I do read the setting material that's available and I read it closely, because for me, it's not so much about like, I want to perfectly telegraph this setting to the players, but more I want to prepare myself so that I can deliver important details as needed, so that I can, I have it internalized to where I can authentically deliver the setting, or at least my part of the emergent setting.
Yeah.
It's more of a prep thing for me.
That's interesting. And what would you say are some of like the advantages of having the group kind of nebulously define the world they live in as they go along? Why is this a good idea?
Well, I have a feeling that you have a lot of answers to your own question here, and I will let you run through them. But
I was giving you first shot at your favorite.
Thank you for giving me first crack at it. I appreciate that. I will tell you, I think to me, the number one advantage is it facilitates good role playing. So I have in the past spoken about not really caring for what I call an ornate setting. And to me, an ornate setting is one that has so many moving parts and so many bizarre or atypical details that it starts to kind of overwhelm the role play and starts to make players feel uncomfortable about the role play, like they're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
And to me, when you're kind of generating your setting on the fly or in a more emergent way, you're really facilitating the role playing because you're not saying, okay, this is the hard truth of this world, and if you deviate from that, you're doing it wrong. You're saying, this is our truth for this world, and by definition, you're doing it right. I think that's the biggest thing. When you are trying to mind meld at the role-playing game table and come up with a shared story, that is something that we do well as humans, and so it's not a completely hopeless task. I don't think it's hard to do, but it's certainly much easier to do if you're all able to get on the same page quickly. And the easiest page to get on quickly together is a blank one, or close to blank one.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, one of my notes says, it's a real leveler between people who know a lot about, say, the background or the game system, and people who don't. And you can let people who are experts on a thing be the experts, but other people don't need to know that stuff. I was running Winter's Daughter, this Dormanwood OSR adventure the other day, and one of the players, she's this teenage girl, plays a lot of 5e, I assume, and she's like, can my character be a dragonborn? That's a thing, right? And I said, sure, what does that mean? And then she just kind of briefly explained what they do, and I was like, yeah, that sounds great. And she was in charge of knowing what the heck her character was, and nobody else needed to know too much, and that was fine. There is that thing of, honestly, it just saves a lot of time, I think. Like, you don't need to suddenly remember a fact about the setting and kind of go back like, oh, no, wait, Alderaan's already been destroyed by this time in the Star Wars universe. I guess we don't go there. That kind of thing. Right, yeah. So it's good in that way.
Well, and not just saves time, but also I would say, this kind of goes back to my point of like making the role-playing easier. It also kind of gives you permission to retcon.
Yes.
Sometimes you're in the middle of a game. You decide as a group, it would be better if the story was Y and not X. And if you're not, like when you have a slightly looser, more implied or emergent sort of setting, something that's not so like hardwired into what the experience is, you feel a lot better about that. It's like, okay, fine. We'll just retcon it and make it this other thing instead, and it's no big deal. I think that's harder to do in a much more like precisely defined setting. I think you run the risk of sort of running afoul of like the truisms of the setting or whatever.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I think is actually quite important about the way implied settings are created, and not like saying, oh, this is what the world is like, but through the choices you make at the table, is that it can make the game more like the game everyone taken as a Gestalt entity wants to play. We've talked in the past as that's right, Gestalt.
Gestalt entity, I love it.
We've talked in the past about how, like, if you're GMing and you kind of have a bunch of NPCs or situations going on, and you don't personally push them, but you wait to see which characters the players go back to talk to when they return to the safe village, that tells you what they're interested in, and that's the stuff you should follow up on. And in the same way, like all the individual contributions from the GM and players when you're using an implied setting, it reflects a collage of the group that the game actually wants to play. Like, if nobody plays a wizard, maybe this fantasy world is one where they're rare or they don't exist, or at least they're not the protagonist. Or if somebody does play a wizard, then it's a setting where it's possible to tamper with supernatural forces but still be a sympathetic character.
Right, yeah.
You know, that kind of thing. You're defining your genre by a jigsaw of the things that everyone's contributing. I think that's a positive thing. It means you're making the game more like the one everyone wants to be doing.
That's great. I'm going to steal one of your notes.
Sure.
This kind of play is great for open tables. I mean, obviously, open tables are something you and I do a lot. And tell you what makes it much easier to do. That is greatly aided when you don't have to explain tons of like hard setting details.
Yeah. And my final note in this bit, the good stuff, is what I named the Star Wars effect. And I need to be more specific about which Star Wars effect I'm referring to. So this is like we were talking about, the idea of having the names of stuff and not necessarily knowing in detail, what it looks like or what it is. If you watch the film Zatoichi, directed by and starring Beat Takeshi Kitano, very good, he keeps a lot of the fight scenes off screen. And the reason is nothing they could actually put on the screen will be as good as the amazingly cool fight scene that you're imagining going on behind that door. And like in a similar way, when Star Wars first came out, the Star Wars prequels could have been the greatest movies ever made. They were not. And they still would not have been as cool as what 8-year-old kids imagined when they heard the phrase the Clone Wars.
Right, yeah.
So, like, you can mention things in the background, like some empire that's in the distance and sends its sinister agents. But if you never visit that empire, that's probably for the best, because then it can be everything. Everyone around the table will be imagining something different and sinister and powerful or whatever. And they'll all be having a way better time than if they actually saw what it was like.
No, that's a great point. Well, so what are some issues here as far as this sort of setting generation goes?
I think the biggest one is then conflict of expectations. So we've talked about how, everyone gets to have their own thing. When worlds collide, it's not always that great. So, what do you mean Alderaan hasn't been blown up? What do you mean elves hate trees? This kind of thing. So if people's assumptions are different, that can be a problem. And the answer here, of course, is, I think, cats, which I'm going to ask you to briefly explain because I can never remember what those letters stand for. Was it charisma, agility? No.
Acronym that stands for concept, aim, tone, and subject matter. We've talked about it a million times. But
Yeah,
I see what you're saying.
that's enough.
The answer is to set expectations appropriately.
Exactly.
I agree.
Yeah. Then the other problem then is I think there's a fine line between a fruitful void, to use a phrase, and just being annoyingly vague. To some degree, you've got to have things pegged out as things that exist, and crossing that line, I think it can be difficult to know what that line is. I don't necessarily have any like hard and fast guidelines for fixing that problem. I think you just have to kind of feel your way through it. I mean, I don't know. You GM way more often than I do. What do you do with that?
I think I avoid this problem mostly because I'm a much more table talky kind of GM than most people. If something isn't making a lot of sense, or if there's like some vagueness, or there's a gap, I detect a gap in everyone's sort of shared understanding. We stop and we work it out, and then we continue with the fiction. That's how I handle it.
Yeah, like little timeout basically. Yeah, I think that's probably the way. Maybe remind or encourage players to speak up if they're confused or vague about a thing. A lot of the time people keep quiet, and then that kind of makes the problem sit around and get worse. So I think as soon as you're confused, if you're a player, you should say so. Like, even if it makes you interrupt a bit or look like a bit of maybe feel like a bit of an idiot. But don't worry, you're not an idiot. They're just not explaining properly.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's run through some quick best practices then for if you're going to try to do this sort of emergent setting creation at the table. What are some best practices here?
Well, we've talked about the establishing exploitation. So yeah, decide what are key facts about what genre or what setting you're going to be in. If you're doing a film noir thing, then this is going to be a world where male and female societal roles are very important and affect what you can do. Presumably it's going to be in a certain time period, roughly. Yeah, there'll be a little bit of dream logic to it. Maybe I'm analysing film noir too much, but yeah, that kind of thing. But then, yeah, leave blanks, as Dungeon World says, so that there's, Dungeon World, Apocalypse World, and of course, Fear of a Black Dragon, the popular award-winning podcast.
Right, yeah.
And when it comes to expertise, figure out who knows stuff.
Right.
And defer to them on that. Like, I once ran a vampire game where one of the players had been in the army, parachute regiment, I think. So he knew what it felt like to be hit with a stun grenade, because they make you do that in training, apparently. So when that happened, we just kind of gave him the floor for a good 5 minutes to explain in excruciating detail what it felt like. It was really good.
Was there anything else you want to say about this topic? I mean, I think we had a good little convo here.
I think we've done it. I'd like to conclude with a quote. I'd like to do the logical fallacy of appealing to authority and quote Robin Laws, the designer of Feng Shui and many other role-playing games. And he says, "When you feel the tingle of a plot block dancing on your tongue, the easiest thing to do is nothing. Just don't say that. At the end of the session, you can regale the rest of the group with your superior fire escape knowledge while also implicitly praising the GM for not letting stuff that doesn't matter kill momentum."
Yep.
This is good advice. Let's all do that.
Agree completely. Let's go to the companion adventures. Yay. It's the companion adventures. Shall we start with film? We have a lot of films here.
Yeah, we've both got a lot of stuff on this, which is kind of surprising, but yeah.
I'm not super committed to all mine, so
Okay.
Mine are barely recommendations. Go, but you start.
Okay, my first film recommendation is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 1966, directed by Sergio Leone. It's a film about a bunch of misfits searching for gold in the middle of a civil war. So basically, it's the plot of Times That Fry Men's Souls, but with better guns.
I'll throw out the 2000 Mel Gibson film Patriot. Not an amazing movie, and not even remotely historically accurate, but it does take place during the American Revolution, and it adds a healthy dollop of gore atop that pop culture milieu. So that's something you might find interesting.
Yeah, interesting one. All right, so I've got the 1975 Stanley Kubrick film Barry Lyndon, and I guess the book by Thackeray, The Luck of Barry Lyndon. This was my favourite film for many years. I'm not sure if I have a favourite film anymore, but it's a picaresque adventure across Europe rather than America, but still, it's got spies, it's got armies with muskets, it's got like random villages and stuff going on. So yeah, very good. Bit long, bit depressing, but very much worth watching.
I will throw in the 1999 film Ravenous. This takes place a little bit later, to be fair, during the Mexican-American War, but it's a near similar time period, or close to the time period of Times of Rye, and deals with some supernatural and cannibalistic elements, which comes up quite a bit in Times of Rye.
Yeah, I remember reading reviews of that, but I've never seen it, to my regret. My next one is Lafayette, 1961. It's not actually very good, but you can watch it for free because I think it fell out of copyright. And it has Orson Welles in it as Benjamin Franklin. Quite bizarre performance that I recommend watching just for that, like 5 minutes he's in.
Nice. You may not be aware of this, Tom, but in 1976, many American capitalists were trying to cash in on the bicentennial.
I was about to say why, and then I remembered dates. Yeah, okay.
Right, yeah. And there was that year a whole rash, and rash is the right way of putting it, a whole rash of bicentennial horror films. Most of them were focused on American folklore, such as the quite awful Johnny Hatchetsy. These movies were very bad. They were cash-ins. One of them, Ghosts of Yorktown, is more of a historical approach rather than a folklore approach, and it features a pretty terrific scene of a redcoat being sort of like gored from behind by a bayonet, and his body collapses, and standing behind him is a bloody, gore-covered George Washington. So
that actually does sound kind of amazing. And then for my last film recommendation, Le Pacte de Loup, 2001, aka Brotherhood of the Wolf, starring that guy off the American chef competition show, whatever. Mark Dacascos, that's the guy. He's actually kind of got a secondary role, but he's the coolest thing in it. If you want to see how to do an action movie, combat-heavy scenario in this era, this is the one to go for. It's based on the Legend of the Beast of Gévaudan in France. Yeah, it's kind of an absolute mishmash of all the action genres, but it's worth a watch. And just as a fun film side note, I want to throw in, while I was researching this, I found out about The Spirit of 76, which is a lost film from 1917. And the producer, Robert Goldstein, was charged in federal court with violating the Espionage Act because, at the time, the US was an ally with Great Britain during the First World War, and they reckon that this could cause insubordination, disloyalty, and mutiny by US soldiers and prospective recruits. And he got 10 years in prison, which was later commuted by President Wilson to 3 years, which is still kind of 3 years too many.
I think so, yeah. I have a little TV recommendation, a very highly specific recommendation. In Hex 104, we have that little side story about the father trying to recover his runaway children, and he sends this agent after them. And this agent, she's posing as a nanny, but she's described as like quite a sinister person. She's like very sweet and nanny-like on the surface, but very sinister on the, she's a sinister agent underneath it. I'm going to recommend, as a specific role-playing note, Sarah Paulson in Deadwood. She plays a character called Ms. Isringhausen. She is hired as a nanny/tutor, but she's actually a Pinkerton agent, and she's sinister and wicked, and I would actually put money on the character in Hex 104 was probably inspired by this character in Deadwood. I'm just going to guess that was probably the case.
All right, okay, I've got a game. Finally, we got game recommendations. My one is The Bloody Forks of the Ohio by Jason Morningstar, which is a scenario that I believe is available for free download.
It is.
It's based on Lady Blackbird, and it has player characters including George Washington and various native and English and Continental Army characters on either side. And you just play Lady Blackbird and try to not lose.
I've got a couple of other Jason Morningstar recommendations. I think for when you start to step into historical things, you inevitably end up at his games. Carolina Death Crawl, Civil War setting, I know. But I think it's very, very good as far as like a sort of crawling through a war-torn Americana. It's very, very good for that. It has a lot of like horror elements that are reminiscent of the ones in Times at Fry, but not supernatural. Well, it does actually, as I'd say, it's not supernatural, but it is. You have ghosts. So
you turn into a ghost when your character's out. Is that right?
Yeah, the swamp ghosts or something like that. But it's a great game, little one-shot game. I definitely recommend it. And then the other game I just thought of during our expert delve, and I can't think of the name of it. You're gonna have to remind me.
Oh no!
But it's the one where you yes and everything. You know, you have the little cards, and you're like,
oh no, I can't do this on the spot.
I know.
I've lost it.
I've lost it too. Anyway, maybe we'll do a little like robot edit in the name of this game.
The game in question is Archipelago 3.
But basically, what I love about it is it kind of lets the players take control of the emergent setting. It's a sort of emergent setting game, and it actually assigns players. Each of the players has like control of one aspect of the setting. So maybe one player's in charge of history, one player's in charge of religion, one player's in charge of magic, and they have the final say on those areas of the setting that people introduce. And so it's kind of a mechanical version of the expert delve topic in a way. Listeners, that's our show. We hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Our first recording after being away from it for what feels like months and months.
Yeah.
Fear of Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find us on gauntlet-rpg.com, on Twitter at gauntletrpg. We have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/gauntlet. Please go support the show there. Tom, thanks so much.
Jason, thank you.
Bye-bye. Hey listeners, Jason here. I want to let you know that Brindlewood Bay is now available in the Gauntlet's $6 Patreon feed. Brindlewood Bay is a Powered by the Apocalypse game about a group of elderly women solving murder mysteries in and around the namesake town. As they investigate these crimes, they become increasingly aware of the activities of a dark cult called the Midwives of the Fragrant Void, and will have to come up with a plan to stop them. The game is basically Murder, She Wrote meets The Shadow over Innsmouth, and we think you're going to love it. Your $6 pledge in February gets you everything you need to play Brindlewood Bay. The core rules, including a file for printing them as a zine, character sheets and other play aids, plus 5 mysteries: Dad Overboard, All Hallows Scream, The Great Brindlewood Bay Bake Off, Jingle Bell Shock, and A Murder Most Mucky. So head over to patreon.com/gauntlet and make a $6 pledge to get Brindlewood Bay. Keep your pledge active, and you'll also get new issues of our magazine Codex every month. Thanks.